Hey guys, it's Taran and welcome to the On Track channel and to my 2023 race ratings for the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. So a very warm welcome as always to this race rating series, taking a look at the past weekend of action and seeing how the drivers have done on the Sunday, how they've done in the race, comparing sort of where they've started, finished, some moves they've made and their general pace overall. This weekend, of course, we were in Baku at the Baku Street Circuit for round 4 of the championship in Azerbaijan. Now, before we get into it all, I just want to put a quick reminder out there that if you do end up enjoying the video, to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content on the channel this season. Now, without any further ado, let's get into it. So, in terms of a result, it is Sergio Perez who takes his second win of the year, Red Bull's 4th in a row, but 2 for Perez, 2 for Verstappen, with Max finishing in 2nd place in this one, the first time where Checo sort of looks a little bit more comfortable ahead of him. In 3rd place, a first podium of the year for Charles Leclerc, very well deserved, drove incredibly well all weekend, and is really deserved this season. In 4th place, Fernando Alonso not quite managing to continue his streak of 3rd places, with Carlos Sainz in 5th ahead of Lewis Hamilton, the lead Mercedes, Lance Stroll splitting the 2 in 7th, and then George Russell in 8th, also picking up the fastest lap, which I feel like this season may end up just being a case of whoever's last of the first 4 teams is going to get that fastest lap. In 9th, Lando Norris picking up a couple of points, and Yuki Tsunoda for AlphaTauri rounding out the top 10. Getting into the race itself, and it's fair to say, well, we had a race at least, and there was some action, however it only really came at the start, or the safety car restart, and other than that there really wasn't too much else going on. Obviously at the beginning you had a few people shuffling positions, and you had sort of Leclerc losing out to Verstappen really quickly once the DRS was opened up, Perez also there as well, and then obviously we had the safety car for Nick de Vries where he hit the wall, and we weren't quite sure if he'd just stopped there, whether or not he'd come in, and whether or not we would get a safety car, and eventually we did. People like Verstappen and Hamilton pitting just before that safety car really hurt them, Verstappen falling from 1st down to 3rd, Hamilton from 5th down to 10th. A lot of the lower half of the grid had already pitted before that, the tyre wear on the mediums, and the softs especially we saw in the sprint the day before, extremely high, so the hard tyres were really the ones to go on. From the restart though, the Red Bulls did look comfortable at the front, and they just sort of checked out once Verstappen got back past Leclerc pretty much straight away. Those two just pulled away by a number of tenths per lap. In behind, you then sort of had Leclerc and Alonso kind of separating themselves from the group of Sainz and Hamilton and Russell and Stroll, all in behind. George Russell especially had a terrible restart, went from 5th all the way down to 8th. And I remember thinking, he started the restart 5 places above his teammate, and within a couple of laps was 2 places behind. We'll get onto him a little bit later on, but in terms of the top order, that was what was going on. Now, for the rest of the grid, it was pretty much a case of everyone stuck behind Esteban Ocon and Nico Hülkenberg, the pair starting on the hard tyres from the pit lane and electing to just go as long as they could, hoping for a safety car or a red flag to come in late. So late, in fact, that they both pitted on either the second to last or very last lap of the race, and in Esteban Ocon's case, to the point where everyone in the pit lane thought they were done. They came out onto the pit lane. Even the officials started putting out the barriers for Parc Fermé come the end of the race. And then all of a sudden the Alpine's coming down the pit lane. And actually the onboard from Esteban is quite a scary look. The people really only just get out of the way at the last minute. And as I kind of speak, F1 have launched an investigation into the matter because honestly it's something that just can't be happening. And I think it's pretty obvious to anyone watching that it can't be the case, especially after a couple of years ago we had a similar situation with Alex Albon in Australia making a pit stop on the very last lap pretty much. It does sort of speak for the race though, that when the most sort of like interesting or most action moment of the race is the fact that there were people kind of in the pit lane at the end, it does sort of tell you how the race has gone in general. Now on to some ratings for the race itself then, and starting with the poll that I gave you guys to fill out after the race. Apologies, was a little bit delayed, got a bit distracted after this one, but you guys have given it a 3.8. It's definitely the lowest of the season, and one of the lowest I think I've had since I've started doing this series, and honestly, justifiably so. There really wasn't too much going on, and 3.8, a low rating from you guys is fair. For my rating then, I've actually gone with a 3. When I look back at a lot of races that we've had, maybe apart from Monaco, where that's somewhere you go and you just expect nothing to happen, for a track like Baku, we really do expect more. And the fact that we only really got any sort of action around the start and the restart really kind of sums it up. And I think what was really worrying was the fact that drivers were talking about how hard it was to stay close and how hard it was to get past, considering that, you know, just a year ago we were talking about how great it is that drivers can now follow, and to sort of see that it's already kind of taking a little bit of a step backwards, that was more worrying than just the race being a bit of a dull one. You know, those do come around. But I think that more than anything was really what made it worse for me. I mean, obviously the race itself wasn't action-packed, there wasn't a ton going on, there's no point trying to sugarcoat it and say that there was, but, you know, there were bits and pieces that we'll dive into, a couple of nice drives here and there, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a bit. First up then is the Alfa Romeo of Valtteri Bottas, and someone who really wasn't having a great start to the season, and honestly I can say it got even worse in Baku. I didn't think that was possible, but it's kind of what happened. He was running dead last throughout pretty much the entire race, only finished above Nick de Vries and Zhou Guanyu because they retired, was the only driver to have to complete sort of 3 pit stops. He went from mediums to hards to hards to mediums. Only one other driver even made 2 pit stops, and that was Pierre Gasly. Everyone else on the 1. He did have some damage, I think, from a collision early on where Magnussen sort of ran into the back of him at turn 2 on the opening lap. And I do think there was some damage there, because even if Valtteri's having a bad season, he isn't that far away from everyone. So that is a bit of a consideration, but even so, it just seemed to be an appalling weekend for him. No pace, didn't like the car wasn't great. So rating-wise for Valtteri, obviously there was some damage there, so it's still a 3.5. If there hadn't been any damage, you're looking at like a 1.5-ish performance, because it was so far away from everyone else. Then next up we have Zhou Guanyu, the other Alfa Romeo driver, and it was a little bit better from him. You know, he had a steady stint early on, starting on the medium tyres, was actually up to about 8th place because he was one of those that didn't pit of those back half of the grid. Pitted under the safety car and ended up in 14th. However, after the safety car restart, just continued to kind of drop backwards, found himself very much a part of that behind Hülkenberg, behind Ocon's sort of train of people, but even within that was still kind of slowly moving backwards. I do think the Alfa Romeo was by far the worst car this weekend. However, even in a bad car, to still be within that train, maybe you'd have liked to see him just hold on to a couple of positions. Compared to his teammate, a better race, I would say for sure. Rating-wise for Zhou, obviously he retired, but I'd still give him a rating. He went far enough in. I think it'll be a 5. It's probably just about an average race. It's kind of hard to grade because of what the car looked like. However, I think on the whole, you can probably say he's done fine, considering it was a really terrible car this weekend. Next up then we have the Alpines, and I'm going to start with Pierre Gasly, who started the race down his 17th after a pretty horrendous couple of days of qualifying, sprint racing in general, crashes, engine blowing up on him, pretty horrific start to the weekend. And while he wasn't out of it, having any crashes or any issues come the race, it wasn't too much better in terms of results and how he was doing. Pitted before the safety car and ended up very much stuck in the train like most of the grid behind Alex Albon, was the only driver who elected to go for that 2-stop, pitting onto another set of hard tyres, which dropped him to the back of that, and he did sort of make his way back up towards the front of that train, but very much stalled out in that sort of middle range, and actually only finishing right next to his teammate Esteban Ocon, who, as many of us will know, had the strategy of taking hards for as long as possible. Didn't manage to get up to the back of Magnussen or Albon, who he was with when he pitted the second time, so while the strategy is very much on the team trying to do something, he hasn't quite made it work and it hasn't been the best overall race. Luckily for him, I'm not going to deduct points for the qualifying and the sprint qualifying. These are just based on the race on the Sunday. And so for Gasly's race, I think it'll be a 5. He's done okay. The strategy wasn't great. To be honest, it just seems like an average drive. It wasn't horrific or anything. Started further down, finished higher up. Did overtake some people, albeit on fresher tyres, but still a pretty average race, I would say. And then next up we have Esteban Ocon, who started from the pit lane alongside Nico Hülkenberg, so back effectively on the very last row of the grid, starting in effectively what was P20, very last place. And he started on the hard tyres and did take them a long way, as we saw, to the very last lap of the race in fact. Good on him to be able to take the tyres that far. and that takes a lot of management and actually being able to hold off cars behind. It probably helped that Hulkenberg was behind him the whole time, but he still managed to keep everyone behind, and actually, come the end of the race, people weren't actually passing him or catching him up, unlike Nico Hulkenberg behind him, who was getting passed by Norris and Tsunoda. And as you saw, Ocon, when he pitted, he didn't come out that far behind anyone and actually finished, as I say, right alongside his teammate who went for the two-stop strategy onto the hard tyres, finishing in 15th place, so he wasn't even that far away. In terms of making it work, he's actually done incredibly well, taking those tyres as long as he has, maintaining the pace that he has, and genuinely, if there was a safety car late on, would have been in such a good position to strike for those bottom end of the points. But as it was, there weren't any safety cars, and there's nothing really he could do about that, but he did the best he could with what he was given. So rating-wise for Esteban, I actually think it's going to be a 7. It's hard to give him more than that because ultimately he has finished 15th, not really down to his own fault, but still it's what I'd say is a good and solid drive, taking those tyres for pretty much the entire race with good pace. Next up, Haas, and I'll start with Kevin Magnussen. Contact on lap 1, as is sort of a tradition of his to break your front wing, running into the back of Bottas. Not really much he could do, Valtteri just slowing down and him hitting the back of him. From there, just ran a generally average race. There's really not too much to go over with him. Pitted under the safety car, swapped from his mediums onto hard tyres, and then, like most of the grid, found himself in the train behind Ocon and Hulkenberg. Made a little bit of progress, you got the likes of Ocon in there, who eventually got past a bit on strategy, but generally was just stuck behind Alex Albon most of the time. In terms of a rating, I think it's going to be a 5.5. It's pretty much average. It's hard to say more than that. Didn't really make too much progress while in that train, but the Williams is pretty quick in a straight line, so it would be asking quite a bit to make that pass. Next up then, Nico Hulkenberg, the other driver to start from the pit lane with Esteban Ocon, and one that started on hards as well, and went with the strategy of taking it for as long as he could, in this case, pretty much the entire race. And unlike Ocon, he did get passed by some cars towards the end, with Norris and Tsunoda getting by, but in general managed to hold off a lot of the cars behind him for most of the race. It was only sort of 5 or 6 laps from the end when people did get past him. So to do that on one old set of hard tyres is a pretty good job, especially when you consider that that Haas car isn't at the level of an Alpine and it's much harder to do so. With that in mind, taking into account where the Haas car is and the fact that he did get past, so one sort of boosts his rating, one lowers it, I'm going to give him a 7.5, basically what I gave Ocon, but even slightly higher. I think just considering the car that he's in, to be able to hold off everyone behind him on those softer tyres, or not softer tyres, but newer tyres that they were all on, it's a really good job by Hulkenberg, and like Ocon, if a safety car or red flag had come out late, he would have been in a really great position. Next up then, Williams, and I'm going to start with Logan Sargent in this one. Started up in 14th, which is pretty good for him, got into Q2 for the first time this year. Managed to maintain that position early on, but stopped before the safety car, which meant that when everyone else pitted, he was relegated pretty much to the back of the train with the likes of Bottas and Joe. You know that when you're hanging around with the Alfa Romeos, it's not gone too well. In terms of the rest of the race, just sort of slowly dropped back from there to the point where he was actually around 10 seconds or so away from Albon, his teammate, come the end of the race. So pace-wise, it wasn't too great. However, was done over a bit by the safety car, which put him sort of 4 or 5 places back from where he was originally running. And I think in that Williams car, with the straight line speed it has, he would have been able to maintain and hold on to that. However, we did see his pace at the back of the train, falling off the back of Kevin Magnussen, falling away from Albon, all those cars ahead of him. So strategy wasn't really much he could do about it, but pace-wise, it wasn't too great. And I think I'm going to give him a 3.5 for it. It might be a little bit harsh, you compare him to Bottas, but then as far as I'm aware, Sargent didn't have any damage. He was just generally a little bit slow. Next up then, Alex Albon, who started up in 12th place, fairly high up for the Williams, and like his teammate, pitted just before the safety car, which relegated him down a couple of places to around 14th place, I believe. From there, was sort of stuck in the train, but did manage to keep up with the likes of Piastri for a while, eventually dropping just a few seconds off of him, but managing to keep the likes of Kevin Magnussen behind him, eventually making his way back up to finish in 12th place, helped a little bit by the strategies of Hülkenberg and Ocon. So given that he didn't have the best strategy when it came to the safety car, the fact that he's managed to sort of finish where he started, he's done fairly well. Nothing special in this one, and obviously the pace compared to his teammate, as I've just mentioned with Sargent, he was much better and much further up the road. Rating-wise for Albon, there's not really much else he could have done. I think he's recovered well enough post the safety car, and the pace that he's shown relative to a McLaren or Tsunoda in the AlphaTauri isn't too bad, so I think it's going to be a 6 for him. Nothing special or anything, but just that little bit above average for what I say for this Grand Prix. Next up then, we have AlphaTauri, and I'm going to start with the good in this one because believe me, there is some bad to get onto. And that is, of course, Yuki Tsunoda finishing in 10th place, picking up a point, his second of the year, 2 10th places in a row. It's another good result for him. And in general, as the race went along, he did fairly well considering, like I say, the predicament that most of the back of the grid found themselves in. Started in 8th place, but he did have Lance Stroll and George Russell behind him, so they were always realistically going to get past. And so his fight for the whole race was with the likes of Lando Norris, who he kept up with pretty much the entire time. Admittedly, they were both behind Nico Hülkenberg, but still he was tailing the back of that McLaren, not letting Piastri and the other McLaren too close to him, did pull a little bit of a gap to him, and then eventually got by Hülkenberg and sort of was still behind Norris, came away with the final point. So I think the situation that he's found himself in, stuck behind Hülkenberg and Ocon, etc., as most of the back half of the grid did, he's done well to come away in one of just 2 points positions after the first 4 teams. So I think for Yuki, it's probably going to be a 6.5. It's really hard to give those drivers who are stuck in the queue more of a grade, considering they haven't really overtaken anyone and they have been stuck for most of the race. So it's sort of like who's done better within that train, if that sort of makes sense, which I guess is why Yuki's above average. But yeah, a 6.5 for him feels fair. He's come away with a point. It's what I say is a good drive, but definitely considering he was stuck most of the time, it's not amazing or anything like that. And then we get on to Nick de Vries, who started in 18th place, only really because Ocon and Hülkenberg started from the pit lane, was running generally towards the back, and then 9 laps in, literally 20% of the way, clips the inside wall on turn 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 maybe, and then he's out. That's it. Breaks the front left suspension. He can't do any more, and honestly, it just summed up what had really been a horrific weekend for him. Multiple crashes, so many incidents, the pace wasn't there. I think, honestly, for a while, it's been one of the worst general weekend performances that I can sort of remember, in the sense of absolutely nothing went right for him. In terms of a rating just for the Sunday, I think it's going to be a 2. The reason it's not any lower is because it's not like a horrific crash where he's destroyed the car and cost his team a lot of money, but it is just a silly one. It's one that absolutely doesn't need to be made. It's not made by him pushing the car too hard or trying to find the limit. He's just cut the curb a bit too much and broken the car. Maybe he was a little unlucky. We saw a number of other drivers do that. Pretty sure Carlos Sainz was one of them. He got away with it. But De Vries didn't, and ultimately he's out of it. And considering then his teammate scores a point when those 1 or 2 points are really valuable to those lower half teams, it's not a great weekend and sort of topped off by not a great race for him. Next up then, we have Oscar Piastri. Started in P10, did have Russell behind him, who was probably going to get past. Like most people, on the medium to hard strategy with the safety car, but like most people, I'm going to say it again, back half of the grid, stuck behind Nico Hülkenberg. In his case, also stuck behind Tsunoda with teammate Norris ahead. Generally kept the pace. It wasn't like he was falling a mile away from them, but wasn't really making any inroads and eventually finished just outside of the points in P11. So considering that all of the top 4 teams finished, P11 is not a bad result. It is lower than he started, but then again, George Russell was behind him, so that's always going to happen. I think for Piastri, it's a fairly average race. There wasn't overly too much of note. The only thing I would say was apparently he was really ill throughout the whole weekend, so the drive that he's put in does kind of take that into account in terms of a rating. But in general, I think it would say it was fairly average. It's going to be a 5.5 for him. He was very ill this weekend, but he's slightly behind his teammate, drove fine pace-wise, he's done okay, and so it's a fairly average grade for that as a whole. Next up then, Lando Norris, who pretty clearly seemed to be the top of the quote-unquote midfield for this one throughout qualifyings and sprint qualifyings, and even the race in general, you know, finishing up in 9th place, sort of the best of the rest position. And when you take into account that the pace of the car means he's a whole pit stop behind George Russell ahead of him, who was able to pit for a fastest lap attempt, it shows that he's done fairly well given the car that he's in. Obviously, he's been stuck behind Hülkenberg and Ocon for the entire time. However, we saw that it was really difficult for anyone to pass, and the fact that everyone in that train didn't, I think it was just sort of more to do with the track and the cars themselves than Norris and his McLaren. However, being at the front of the train, sort of, I mean, he did have Hülkenberg behind Ocon, maybe it would have been nice to see something, but ultimately, it's not cost him a position or anything because those two pit and he slots up behind Russell. So for a performance for Lando, I think I'm going to give him a 7. It may be a little bit high, but then when I think about how he's the top of those midfield drivers, he has done well. He's been a bit quicker than his teammate. It's a generally good drive. I think 7 maybe is a little bit generous now that I look back at it. But top of those other guys, picked up 2 points, which is the most that anyone in the bottom 5 teams can realistically hope for. He's done all right. So next up then, Mercedes, and I'm going to start with George Russell, who really didn't have the best of weekends, actually. It's the first time this year where I've sort of looked at him and seen a very clear gap with Hamilton ahead. There's been a few times when Russell's been ahead this year, a number of times when they've been sort of even, but then it definitely looked like Hamilton was very much clear of him the whole weekend. I'm pretty sure the only session that George topped him in was the final part of sprint qualifying, and then the sprint itself, when not really much happened in terms of movement. For Russell's race, started down in 11th after a poor qualifying, really was helped out by the safety car because he came in, was elevated from sort of 10th place up into 5th, maybe 6th, 5th or 6th. However, the thing that really sums up his race for me was, and I remember thinking this at the time, was Russell was in sort of 5th or 6th place, Hamilton was in 10th, sort of 4 or 5 positions, and within a few laps we had Hamilton overtaking Russell, and he even said of himself it was a really terrible restart for him. And ultimately, given that not many people passed after that, that's just summed up his race. And I have to say, his race, considering pace comparison to teammate, finish comparison to teammate, especially given the fact that after the safety car, he was a number of positions ahead. It's not as if he started from 5 positions back and has never been ahead of him. I think for Russell, it's probably got to go down as a 3.5. It's not the best of races, and maybe it's a bit harsh, but when you're slower than your teammate, you finish worst off, you don't take advantage of being gifted a number of positions, it's a bad performance, I'd have to say. Next up then, Lewis Hamilton in the Mercedes, who definitely had the measure of his teammate Russell for this one throughout all of qualifyings. You know, Hamilton was up in 5th place, that's where he started. Really wasn't helped out by pitting just before the safety car. He had his tyres really going off. The Aston Martin's really breathing down his neck with Fernando Alonso and Stroll. So he came in, pitted, put on hard tyres, and the safety car came out, and he was relegated from that 5th place down into 10th, I think it was, maybe 11th, somewhere around that range. However, where Russell had a really terrible restart, Hamilton had a really good one and very quickly picked off a number of people, managed to gain a lot of places, overtook his teammate, and then took advantage of Stroll when he made a mistake to get up into that 6th place, where he spent most of his time just hovering around DRS range with Carlos Sainz. And I think on pace would say he had more pace than Sainz, but because of how difficult it is to overtake in Baku, never had enough to get by. So finishing P6, even though he started in 5th, really not helped out by the safety car. I'd probably say the biggest loser out of everyone with that safety car. I think overall for Hamilton, it's going to be a 7. It's a good recovery. The pace was better than his teammate. He was probably on par with one of the Ferraris in terms of Sainz, in terms of pace, was ahead of one of the Aston Martins as well, when I think this was the first weekend where Mercedes were probably the 4th quickest team out of everyone. So for him, I think it's a good recovery, good pace on the whole, better than his teammate throughout the whole weekend. Next up then, the Aston Martins, and I'm going to start with Lance Stroll, who started further back in 9th place after having DRS issues in qualifying, eventually were fixed for the race, and he did make some progress early on. You know, really played the team game as well, said he wasn't going to attack Fernando. It's quite interesting to hear that on the radio between those two, with Fernando giving him some advice on brake balance. I did find it quite funny how later on Fernando said, try my settings on brake balance, and Lance immediately proceeded to run wide and Hamilton got by. But in general for him, I think it was a little bit better. And I think in general, when you look at Stroll as a whole, you say, okay, he's finished ahead of Russell, he's kept up with Hamilton, that's good. But then you look at Alonso, who's something like 10-ish plus seconds up the road, and you sort of go, yeah, he's just not on the same level. Admittedly, Alonso is driving incredibly well, but I think pace-wise it is a little bit disappointing. So I think for Stroll, for the rating, it's probably going to go down as like 5. I would say, you know, he's beaten one of the Mercedes, but ultimately he's finished 7th of 8th, whereas his teammate was challenging for the podium. A little bit to do with qualifying, but still maybe would have liked to have seen a little bit more from him, especially considering that, you know, he was basically right on the back of Alonso and Hamilton early on, but he's finished a fair way off of his teammate. Next up then, the other Aston Martin of Fernando Alonso. His first race not finishing on the podium, absolute shocker, how could he not do that? But he still drove a very good race in general, and I think what was really good to see for him was we really saw how well he was measuring himself. He knew that the tyres weren't going to last long, he took his time, let Hamilton ahead of him use up his tyres, and then eventually attacked just at the right time, forced Mercedes into pitting Hamilton, and eventually, you know, I think Alonso probably would have got by in the long run on the race. However, forced Hamilton to pit, which really caught him out with the safety car. And Alonso's pace in general after that was excellent. We saw a really opportune move on Carlos Sainz as well. That was a really nice move down into turn 4, I think it was. Not many overtakes there, but a great move from him. And then he generally kept up with Leclerc, did slip a couple of seconds away, but then caught up right at the end, almost pacing those tyres. And eventually, you know, was only half a second or so away on the line. So very close to that podium. So I think for Alonso, as a rating, it's probably going to go down as like a 7.5. I think I'd almost give him an 8, but I think a 7.5 is probably where I'll go with it. If he had got that podium, it would be higher, like an 8, 8.5. But he was helped out a little bit by the safety car compared to like a Hamilton. Great move on Sainz, had great pace in general, and so overall I think it's a really solid drive for him. Next up then, Ferrari, and I'm going to start with Carlos Sainz. And Ferrari fans, you'll probably hate me for saying it, but it's another kind of disappointing weekend pace-wise, and it's something that we've seen a fair amount of with Carlos, where he just can't compete with Leclerc for raw pace. You know, in qualifying, he was 6 or 7 tenths away, I think. You know, you look at those top 3 of Perez, Verstappen and Leclerc thinking, oh, is Sainz going to join the mix? But no, he's quite a way back. Then in terms of the race, he was dropping off of Leclerc for sure. Alonso got by him. He dropped off of Alonso as well, only just kind of managing to keep Hamilton behind him. So pace-wise to his teammate, though, is the real concern, just not having anything compared to Leclerc. Finishing in 5th, which is an okay result. It's still in the bottom half of the top 8 drivers. By that, I mean the top 4 teams with 8 drivers total. So I think for Sainz, it is probably slightly disappointing in my books, especially considering, as I say, that his teammate was on the podium. So for Sainz, I think rating-wise, it's going to be a 4.5. I wouldn't say it's a bad drive necessarily, but I think you'd like to see a little bit more, just considering the pace of his teammate and where Leclerc finished. Next up then, Charles Leclerc, and a well-deserved podium. Honestly, I'd have to potentially say, other than maybe Perez, a driver of the weekend type performance. 2 pole positions, a podium, 2 podiums if you count the sprint as well, holding off Verstappen in the sprint, doing generally really well throughout the whole weekend, managing to hold off Alonso as well, keeping a good gap there, and being way ahead of his teammate in terms of pace. I think for Leclerc, it's definitely one of the performances of the weekend, and it's what he's capable of. We know that. He's just had a really unlucky and unfortunate start to the year. I don't think there's really too much else to cover with him. Ultimately for Leclerc, I think he was always going to get passed by the Red Bulls. We saw with Verstappen, on the second lap, he was just waiting for the DRS to be activated because he knew he would just breeze by. Verstappen got by so easily, Perez got by fairly easily as well. Leclerc knew his race wasn't with them, and his fight was for 3rd, and that's what he managed to come away with. I think rating-wise for Leclerc, it's probably an 8.5. He's done incredibly well. The pace was great compared to his teammate. The only people ahead of him are the Red Bulls, who are basically untouchable at the moment. So for Leclerc to finish best of the rest, which is weird kind of having two best of the rests, if you know what I mean, it's a great performance from him on the whole, and it's been what he's been doing this season, and finally just a bit of luck going his way. And then finally onto the Red Bulls, and starting with Max Verstappen finishing second in this one, starting second as well. Getting a little bit unlucky, getting caught out by the safety car given he pitted just before. Could the team have reacted a little bit better? I was quite surprised to see them bring him in, especially considering, you know, De Vries had stopped and we're all kind of thinking, oh, is this going to be a safety car? However, it only dropped him down to third place. When you consider that one of the cars ahead of Leclerc, it's not that huge of a loss. He got past Charles basically straight away down into turn 3, he was already up to second. And I think for me, that's where the majority of his rating comes from, is the point after that, where for the first time in a while, just on raw pace, he just didn't have it compared to Perez. And I think that's both testament to Checo on a street circuit where he'd done really well, and also maybe a little bit just of Perez managing the tyres even better. We'll talk about him in just a minute. But in terms of Verstappen's performance, just didn't quite have the pace to Perez, and ultimately it was going to be hard to pass. We saw everyone struggling. So I think had he not been caught out by the safety car, he probably wins the race. However, didn't quite manage to, you know, challenge Perez after that, and never really looked like he was going to. I think for rating them for Verstappen, it's probably a 7. I think it still is a really solid drive. He's got past Leclerc quickly. The two were in a world of their own out in front. However, he is a little bit behind his teammate, not far off pace-wise, but still finished behind Perez, which is, you know, unusual for Verstappen. And then finally, Sergio Perez, who takes his second win of the year, and had he not had a terrible sort of problem issue / general qualifying in Australia, would pretty much be tied with Verstappen on points most likely. So for him to take the win, it was really needed, and really sort of confirms that he has got that little bit in there to potentially challenge if things all go his way. I know that it's still very early on, but it was nice to see at least. And I think for Checo in this one, he really just took advantage of the situation that he had. He stopped under the safety car, took the lead. And as I was saying with Verstappen, it's that point after the safety car where we saw his pace and being able to manage the tyres as well. And I think that was really, really crucial for him. You know, he didn't sort of panic. He didn't think, oh my gosh, I've got to build a lead to Verstappen. I've got to get him out of DRS range really quick. I've got to pull away. He just about managed to keep ahead, keep building a steady lead, looked after the tyres, kept it going to the point where it was a few seconds by the end of the race. And honestly, it, like I said, it never really looked in doubt. And that's the first time I think with Perez wins where I've gone, yeah, he just looked comfortable the entire time. So that was really great to see for him. Obviously, he's not pulled away loads from Verstappen, and he did get a bit lucky from the safety car, so that stops it being like a 9 as a rating. But I think an 8.5 is more than deserved. He was the most comfortable driver in this entire race, beat Verstappen on pace, which is something that's so rare for anyone to do nowadays. So for him to do that is really testament to how well he's kind of driving, and, you know, an 8.5 is well deserved. So that rounds out the race ratings for Azerbaijan. No one quite up in that 9 category, a couple of 8.5s with Leclerc and Perez. A lot of people in that sort of middling range, it was very hard to sort of grade those people who are stuck in the train most of the time. You know, I'm generally just looking at where they kind of were in the train. And then a couple of not great performances. I'm looking at you, Nick De Vries and Valtteri Bottas right down the end. Don't really know what was going on with you guys. Even George Russell, you could chuck in the mix, just didn't have a great couple of laps, and that really cost him a lot. Anyways, that is all for now. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed. If you have, do make sure to give the video a thumbs up. Sorry it came out a little bit late. It was my birthday over the weekend, so all was a little bit hectic. But hey, good to be back on it anyway. But yeah, until next time, take care.